We are recording the sessions, and I want to start by introducing Marco Giugni and then briefly saying why I think it is so important for us that he has given his availability to participate in this event. Marco Giugni is a professor of political science at the University of Genève. He's a Swiss Italian of Locarno, which is the part of the Switzerland that looks more like Southern Europe, and is the director of the Institut d'études de la citoyenneté, which has the nice acronym INSIGHT, and is a co-director and has been director or co-director of several important European comparative projects that have contributed a lot to the integration of social movement studies in Europe and to the development of is not only in the field of social movements, but also in the fields these projects have addressed, like migration and employment, the youth, the globalization issues, and so on. And Marco has been very influential, in particular with this reflection on the topic that we are going to address now, which is the interaction between conventional and unconventional forms of participation. So since his PhD, I think we can say Marco has been interested in the ways in which conventional and unconventional politics interact, both on the input side and on the output side of the political system. So he's been looking at the ways in which social movement organizations and parties interact, the ways in which movements affect outcomes, and the way in which conventional and unconventional, contentious and uncontentious forms of politics are related to each other. In the book that we are going to discuss now, Street Citizens, and then the subtitle is the title of Marco's presentation today, Protest Politics and Social Movement Activism in the Age of Globalization. The book has been written with Maria Grassi. I think it is a very important book and extremely interesting for us to discuss because it addresses the central topics in the literature of political participation. So bridges political participations and social movements that have a lot of say, overlappings in practice, but are two types of literature that have developed quite apart from each other, also because of methodological reasons and the type of data which were available. So with the possibility to use large database on electoral activism or surveys on political participation, literature on political participation could address some issues that have remained quite marginal in research on social movements. One is the role of social classes, and which has been in different forms at the basis of a lot of reflections in the literature of political participations, including the effect of this on democracies. So the role of social classes has been addressed also in terms of how much political participations can improve democracy. And the first type of studies were quite pessimistic, stressing the unequal type of participations with core groups that were adults, middle class, highly educated, the elite substantially. And a sort of switch, turning point in political participations that Marco is building upon has been done in the 70s and early 80s with the work of Barnes and Case, Norris, Pippa Norris, Russ Dalton, and others, but having instead observed that unconventional forms of participation have to a certain extent transformed this class or elite bias in political participation, allowing especially younger people to participate. But this is still an open question, how much the type of social class is still influential, so that political participation is at times stressing a class bias rather than reducing it. And the second debate that is also very important and that the book addresses in different chapters is the issues of value orientations and how much some types of values, norms, attitudes can facilitate or jeopardize the development of democracies. So from the early studies of Almond and Putnam on civicness as a necessary cultural preconditions for the development of democracies, research on political participations have landed in ideas of critical citizens, so also the street citizens that Marco and Maria address in the book, stressing the importance of also to a certain extent mistrust for the development of democracy. But it remains to be addressed how much mistrust democracies are able to stand and how to bridge at a certain point unconventional forms of actions and political participations with what happened within the party system and the institutional system. I've been lucky to work together with Marco in several of these comparative projects from CCC to Demos, in which I think the bridge between social movement studies and political participation studies has been helped by the innovations in terms of development of technique to survey protesters during demonstrations that has allowed to address also some of the questions I've mentioned on a broad base of activists. So this is what I wanted to say as a way of introductions of this important to this important book. Thanking Marco once again for his availability to stay with us, and I will give him the floor now. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. And
yes.
Thanks for the presentation. You already anticipated some of the issues that I will address, actually, because as you said, my presentation is based on this book with Maria Grasso from the Queen Mary University of London. I'm now sharing, I think it's already shared, right? The PowerPoint.
Yes, I can see it.
Presentation. Okay. So as Donatella said, the title of my presentation is Protest Politics and Social Movement Activism in the Age of Globalization. So it's a book about social movements, but tackling the issue from the individual level point of view, that is individual participants in social movements and activism. First of all, I wanted to say, but Donatella anticipated already that the book is based on a research project in which she also collaborated, which was the CCC project. CCC was an acronym for something like contextualizing protest, caught in the act of protest, and contextualizing contestation as a subtitle, I think, something like that. And the idea was to study participants in social movements while they are doing this activism, in opposition to standard ways to tackle these issues by serving people through general service, which include participants and non-participants. So everything which I'm going to say must be taken with this sort of filter in mind. That is that what we studied are people doing, already participating, and more specifically participating in a specific type of protest activities, namely street demonstrations. That's why we call the book Street Citizens, actually. So it's a specific form, and as you know, there are many other forms which one could and should study from that point of view. Perhaps first, and Donatella mentioned some of the issues that we tackle in some of the chapters of the book. The book is a bit broader. Actually, at least our ambition was a bit broader. We wanted, on the one hand, stress some of these aspects that Donatella mentioned, like the relationship between institutional and non-institutional politics, the role of class as well, of social class, and still other aspects. But we sort of wanted to tackle a broader range of issues concerning why people participate in demonstrations and why they don't. Sorry. Perhaps first, our analysis, which was based in what we call protest surveys. So we surveyed protesters in different countries, in 7 countries actually, included in the book. And when I say we, of course, it's the whole team, not we as authors of the book. So we very much actually thank all those who have participated in that project in that sense. And then we took this study to engage in a broader reflection, which is the content of the book, which is not simply a research report, but is also a way of reflecting about protest politics and social movements today. And this is sort of explaining the subtitle of the book, which is the title of my presentation, Protest Politics and Social Movement Activism in the Age of Globalization. I admit we took this term a little bit because it's à la mode, and then maybe it could improve selling the book. The first stage in my presentation and in the book actually is to provide some contextual element. That is, we embedded our study in a broader context, which is characterized by a number of features which have been very much stressed by researchers, by social movement scholars, and also other scholars in recent years. I mentioned 4 of them. One is the transformation of the political space that has been ongoing in recent years, perhaps decades, but more recently in the last 2 decades, I would say, which is the emergence of the new cleavage between what Hans-Peter Krisi and his collaborators call the winners and the losers of globalization. That is, globalization has created a divide, which is a different divide as compared to the classical left-right divide of previous years, and they stress very much also the cultural side of this cleavage, of this divide between winners and losers of globalization. So there's this transformation of political space, which then also reflects in a perhaps in a transformation of of protest politics. Or perhaps on the other way around, one could argue that protest politics has contributed very much to the transformation of the political space in Europe and elsewhere. The second one is something that has been mentioned by Donatella. This deepening this is a phenomenon that we know since a long time. The deepening disaffection of citizens from traditional representative politics, or more more conventional ways of doing politics, which reflects in a decreasing, there is a mistake, in an increasing mistrust in political institutions and in democracy, or in the representative democracy, in order to favor more participative and deliberative forms of participation and of the democratic life more generally. The third contextual elements that in which we embedded our study is the rise of new forms of political participation. So in a way, we are observing perhaps a new transformation of the action repertoire and the broadening of the action repertoire. And one of the key aspects that has been mentioned in previous studies is the increasing individualization of protest, which is shown, for example, in the increasing importance of political consumerist activities and what many actually call today the everyday life politics or lifestyle politics as well. There are a bunch of terms that are used to more or less capture the same idea that politics becomes more and more an individualized practice during the whole lifetime, and not only a sporadic intervention in voting on the one hand, or in street demonstration, for example, on the other hand. I might add actually something that I didn't put in this slide, but we address also this aspect in the book, which is the increasing digitalization also of society and how this has affected the way of doing politics, and in particular the way of doing protest politics by citizens, in particular I would say by young citizens, so by the younger generations. And the last contextual aspect, which is a little bit more contingent, I would say, although one may also argue that it's not that contingent anymore, is the economic crisis. Actually, our study, or the empirical material for our study, was done during or in the aftermath of the economic crisis, of the financial first and economic crisis that has struck Europe now about 10 years ago, which, as some have stressed, has perhaps led to a remobilization of old redistributive issues. I'm saying old, referring to this distinction between old and new social movements, or old and new politics. So, and that was another aspect that influenced very much our interpretation of what we found in the data in the end. And I said it's more contingent perhaps, but not that much, because I think we are sort of observing something that could be called a permanent status or state of crisis, because we are now just finished one. We are in a new crisis for other reasons, of course, as you know, but perhaps and this has economic consequences, and perhaps we have to get used to the idea that these periods of crisis, they become more and more common, I would say, unfortunately. The book actually, and all the reflection that we have, starts from an assumption, or put it differently, we have a sort of a background idea, which is the one that you can read at the contours of protest participation, the modality, the forms, the lines around which we can define protest participation. Any specific participation in street demonstrations have changed as a result of these large-scale processes, of these structural changes, like the emergence of this new cleavage, for example, between old and new, winners and losers of globalization and so on. So these changes brought about globalization. That's why we emphasize very much this term in the title, in the subtitle, and then in the book as well. And more recently, changes catalyzed by the economic crisis and the increasing politicization of such processes and related changes by recent social movements. This is what I was hinting at before when I said that perhaps social movements, they are not only the passive subjects of those changes, but they also contribute very much to if not create those changes, to amplify them maybe among the citizenry. So that is sort of background. So why did we take street demonstrations, apart from the fact that that was the subject of the project? But which begs the question, of course. I think this is because still street demonstrations are the most typical form of contention in the modern action repertoire. These aspects are discussed very much in the work by Charles Tilly, but also others, Sidney Tarrow and Doug McAdam, for example. They have very much stressed the fact, in particular, Sidney Tarrow has coined this idea of modular repertoire of contention, and demonstration would be or are very much at the core of this modular action repertoire. Modular in the sense that street demonstrations today, they are used by many different groups on many different issues, which contrasts with what Tilly called the old action repertoires, which were more issue specific in a way. So you picked specific forms of action for specific issues and other forms for other kinds of issues. Today, the street demonstration is this modular, and as others like Pippa Norris, Stefan Valgrave, and others have said, this is has become a normalized form of contentious politics. I will come back to this because this is very close to what we call the pluralization of social movements, or more precisely of protest politics or contentious politics, if we want to use this term. So that's why we focus on street demonstration, which is not to say that well, other forms are not important, which is not to say that the online forms are becoming more important. Of course they are, but we think still that by studying street demonstration or mass demonstration, if you prefer, we can grasp a good bunch of what is going on in what we call protest politics. What were the objectives both of the project and then also by reflection of our study and of our book? Well, it was to study who demonstrate, why they demonstrate, and how they engage in politics, how they get to go into street demonstrations. But that's, of course, is a very broad and very general objective, which is the objective, which is the same objective that I suppose all those who study protest politics and politics more generally have. The other objective was to show cross-national variation, as you might know, and as some of you, of course, know. There have been a lot of comparative studies in recent decades. I would say in the last 3 decades, comparative analysis showing exactly these cross-national variations in protest have multiplied, in particular in what we call following what we call the political opportunity approach, which looks at how contextual aspects relating to the characteristic of and configuration of political institutions and so on, how this may affect the extent and forms and also the outcomes of social movements. And the third objective, which is probably the most important, is to disaggregate protests. There have been calls in recent years as well. Well, one prominent scholar who has often called for this disaggregation of protests is Doug McAdam, for example, but many others, Donatella herself as well, that we shouldn't think of protest politics and social movements as something homogeneous, monolithic actors, but that social movements include and perhaps increasingly so, a variety of different actors mobilizing on different issues or on the same issues for different reasons and so on. Of course, said like that is a bit trivial, but what we wanted to do is to show empirically to what extent this apply, and in the book we focus on a particular way to disaggregate protests, as I'm going to say. This led us to make 3 types of comparison, which structure very much the empirical part of the book and of the analysis. A classical standard comparison across countries. These are the countries that are included in the study: Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, UK. We also had data on Czech Republic, but we excluded this from the analysis because it's Eastern Europe, it's a bit different, so we wanted to keep some kind of homogeneity in our comparative space, focusing on Western Europe rather. But still, within this space, I think we have a lot of variation in terms of opportunity structure, for example, between these different countries. You have more centralized countries, you have more federal countries. Although most of these actually have a strong, except for Sweden perhaps, have a rather strong decentralized or federal structure. Of course, Switzerland, but not only. Suppose Italy as well, and Belgium, obviously. Then another type of comparison is across issues of demonstrations. So here we rely on a sort of classical distinction between cultural and economic issues. This reflects a little bit the old or the standard or the classic distinction between old and new issues. So old would be more like the economic, bread and butter kind of claims and issues and mobilizations, and cultural reflects all this idea of new social movements, investing in another sphere of the social life, and then mobilizing more on lifestyle kinds of issues and quality of life, and so environmental and so on, also emancipation and all this kind of issues. So we rely on this distinction actually, and we wanted to also to study to what extent it still holds or whether, as we sort of argue, there has been recently a sort of blurring between these 2 kinds of issues. And the third type of comparison is the one between, and it's the central one actually, is where we think we have most to say, is between types of demonstrators. This is something that has been studied much less. Of course, there are a lot of studies about profiles of people demonstrating, but there are not so many studies that try to look at different kinds of people that participate in demonstrations or in other forms of protest politics. And we sort of took inspiration from these studies, and we tried to work along, again, a very simple distinction, a binary distinction between what we call occasional and activists, or occasional and activist participants. And here actually we operationalize that by saying that occasional activists are those that in the past 12 months prior to the interviews, they didn't participate to any other demonstrations, whereas activists are those that have participated in one or even more. Actually, some have participated in many more demonstrations. So the degree of I would say of engagement or commitment to street demonstration is what divides. And we wanted to see whether there is a difference and where is this difference, if any. And we wanted to see whether the processes and mechanisms and explanatory factors that have been researched in previous scholarship on all those who participate in social movements are perhaps different depending on whether you are an occasional rather than a more frequent participant. that's the criterion, actually, the frequency of participating, so sporadic versus frequent. So the research question that we had in the book are very much the following. What is the protest potential in Europe? As you know, before we get to study why people participate, we need a sort of reference point. So we have to take into account that there are different potentials for participation in protest activities, as in any other kind of political activity. So this is not the focus of the book, of course, because we relied on other kinds of data, namely the European Social Survey, to show a little bit something that actually has already been shown in many other studies, I have to say. So what is the protest potential? How it has developed over time, especially in the light of those changes, of those structural changes that I've been mentioning earlier. Who protests? And here starts the real interrogation. Who protests? What are the protesters' social structure and class basis, for example? And how this varies across countries, and how this varies across issues, and how this varies across types of demonstrators in terms of their frequency and commitment to demonstrate. Are those the same people? Are they different structurally? In terms of social structure and social characteristics. So this is one kind of questions. The other kind of question is, what is the relationship of protests with institutional politics? This is very much what Donatella has stressed in her presentation or in her introduction. So how is institutional and non-institutional politics linked? And of course, I think this is perhaps one of the most important issues, or at least this is one that interests me the most today. Then, how well embedded are protesters in social networks? As you know, if you are familiar with social movement studies, what some have called the mobilizing structures is something that is crucial for social movements to mobilize, and it's also something that is important to get involved in politics in generally. For example, the classical civic voluntarism model by Verba and collaborators stresses very much this idea of recruitment, of being asked. I participate because I've been asked by someone, along with other explanations, of course, motivation and resources, obviously. Then what are the protesters' cognitive and affective predispositions, so political attitudes and emotions? We also wanted to study this aspect. Emotions is something that has been ignored for a long time, but recently, and not even that recently actually, some scholars have been reintroducing the idea that emotions matter very much for participation in social movements. I'm thinking of the work of James Jasper, for example, Jeff Goodwin, Francesca Polletta, and still others. And Donatella has worked on the emotions, but Donatella has worked on everything, so that's easy said. And finally,
we have worked on that together, Marco.
Oh, really? Right. That's why I remember. And of course, there is the final, the mother of all questions. Why do people protest? What motivates actually for us? What the question, why do people protest, is something that we try to relate to the strength of motivation of protesting. So these are the research questions, the study. And again, I have to stress that, and I pay attention when interpreting what we have found, that we have interviewed, so we are working with people who are already protesting, so who are already participants. So we are not that interested in explaining why people participate versus why they don't, but that's exactly why we focused on this disaggregation aspect and these differences among those who participate. So what we explain, to put it in a more operationalized way, is the degree of commitment to participate. So our dependent variable in all the analysis is the degree of commitment to participate. So we are trying to explain whether some people are more committed than others, how commitment varies across countries, across issues, and across types of demonstrators. This is the conceptual framework of the book, which reflects the research questions that I just mentioned. So we sort of structure our analysis along sort of general model of participation in demonstration. As far as I remember correctly, I think this was very much inspired by a similar model that Bert Klandermans had in a book which now it's quite old. It's 97, I think, the Social Psychology of Protest, which is in my view, a fantastic book from this perspective, but where it doesn't only tackle social psychological aspects, but it has a broader view on participation in social movements. So there is the context, of course, and the context we tackle this aspect in the book through the protest potential, so in chapter 2, and then we have a few aspects concerning what people call the microstructural dynamics, or aspects, if you prefer, the social structural basis of class and other. Institutional politics, the relationship between contentious or protest and institutional politics, chapter 4. Mobilizing structures, as I mentioned before, so the role of organizations, and especially we engage in a discussion of the effect of this digitalization on the role that more classical, more standard organizations might have on the sustainability of mobilization over time. And then the social, what we call the social psychological dynamics, focusing on predispositions, so emotions and attitudes, and the motivations, of course, and all this supposedly. It's not a causal scheme, it's just a sensitizing device to capture what we, and to frame what we have done in the study. I think I will skip this one. This is also a figure that we have in the book. We have tried to make sense of the comparative framework by looking at some of the aspects that some people have classified under the term of political opportunity structure. I'm referring mostly to the work of Hans-Peter Krisi and his collaborators, and I'm one of them, I have to say. So the distinction between the strength of the state on one side, one dimension is the strength of the state, weak states opposed to strong states, or if you prefer to put it the other way, as Krisi does, the openness or closedness of the political institution towards protest and social movements. And the other aspects is the availability or the salience of the class cleavage. So that cleavage that has structured very much all the modern politics, I would say, until recently, and perhaps still structure politics today, in spite of this emergence of new cleavages that we have observed in recent decades. So that's the open question, and this allows us to more or less to classify our countries. What it might be interested in the light of what we found is that here you have the 2 southern European countries. One for you is very important, of course, because it's Italy, where we are now virtually, and the other one is Spain. And we found actually that Italy and Spain behave quite similarly in respect of the aspects that we have been tackling in the book. So now to sort of summarize, I'm checking time already because I know that, okay. Now I'm trying to sort of summarize what we found in each chapter separately. So on each of these aspects that you can see here, starting from the protest potential. In a previous version of this PowerPoint, I also had all the tables, which I put now at the end. So I'm sparing you this probably tedious exercise of looking into tables. So I'm trying to summarize the main issues. So what we find is obviously important cross-national variations in political participation, but also in associational involvement, which is one factor that might also be considered as something that support participation in demonstrations. Variations also in terms of political values or value orientations that affect very much, as Donatella has also stressed, participation in protest activities and demonstrations more specifically, and also much variation across different kinds of political attitudes, in particularly those that have been pointed as being crucial to understand participation in protest activities, namely institutional trust or trust in existing institutions, political institutions, and the feeling of efficacy or effectiveness, if you prefer this term, by single people, by single citizens. So here we have some figures you want to look at, maybe just point to some important aspects. You can see it is taking part in demonstrations. So the potential to take part in demonstration varies very much from 21% in Spain, which is enormous, I would say, to a low 3.1% in the Netherlands. So here you have very different potentials to participate in demonstration. Obviously, this is important more if you want to explain why people participate versus non-participate, less if you look at variations. But as a contextual knowledge, I think it's important to know that these potentials vary very much. And then you have Italy also traditionally a country with a strong potential of participation. Unfortunately, we don't have France, which I would expect to be a little bit more, a little bit aligned with these countries, as opposed to Sweden, Switzerland, for example, and especially the Netherlands in this case. Satisfaction with how democracy works is also very different across countries. Again, you start finding some patterns. Same for trust in country parliament. Again, you see the Southern European countries I mentioned before, Spain and Italy, where trust in the parliament and more generally in political institutions is quite low, perhaps for good reasons. I don't know. That's others to say. Whereas typically my country, for example, Switzerland, always systematically scores quite high in terms of confidence, trust in political institutions. And the same for the Nordic countries like Sweden, for example, or here also the Netherlands. So the analysis of protest potential actually yielded one main finding, perhaps, is that Italy and Spain sort of stand out. The two Southern European countries, they stand out in terms of all these aspects, behavioral and attitudinal aspects that I mentioned before. So they have a larger protest potential for participation. They are less active. People from these countries are less active in less confrontational political activities, such as petitioning, or also in more innovative ones, such as boycotting, political consumerism, and so on. So they are less involved in what we call lifestyle politics. There is a stronger support for lefty values in terms of value orientation. If we look at this traditional left-right value orientation, they show a high degree of alienation from the political system, so which is shown by lower level political trust, but also political interest to some extent, and a narrower satisfaction with democracy. And in terms of trends, which is also something which is important, but a little bit less for our analysis because we don't really have longitudinal data, is that political alienation increased over time. But I mentioned this in the contextual, among the contextual aspects. Then when it comes to the core of the book, actually, I'd just like to ask how much more time I have.
Oops, I was trying to switch the mic. Marco, if you can do it in 15 minutes, that would be...
Okay, 15 minutes.
15.
Yeah, 15 minutes. Yeah. Okay, so just to point maybe some of the aspects, and then to get a sum up at the end. I think that the overall idea is clear. And then, of course, and I understand you have read, at least some of you have read some of the chapters of the book, so maybe would be repetitions. But what we find actually concerning the social structural basis, maybe the most important aspect is that we observe persisting inequalities in protest participation. Here I should have a parenthesis, but anyway, I must stress very much that actually that our analysis also rely on the fact that we are studying a particular type of movements, and we have included what we can call the leftist movements, no? The new social movements, or some of the new social movements in our sample, and also some of the old, and by old I mean the labor movement basically, but all belonging to this area, no? This family, which is on the left side. We didn't include actually rightist movements or movements from the right, which might be seen also as a limitation of the book, and especially I would say in light of what we have observed in the last 2 years, I would say that might be an important limitation that I wanted to share with you. When I say today, here we have to put this into the context of when the data were collected, and actually I think I didn't mention that the data were collected between 2009 2012. So the today is the today of 10 years ago almost. And so maybe the discussion we can come up with we can come back to this actually. So today's street demonstration tend to overrepresent the middle classes and those movements especially. This is something that is known actually, and they underrepresent the working classes. Although we have, I cannot go into the details, some interesting patterns in terms of what do the unemployed, for example, which are all overrepresented in some of the countries. I think Belgium is one, as far as I remember, and underrepresented in other countries, but I cannot go into the detail. Men tend to be overrepresented in many of the countries. For example, in Belgium, Netherlands, and Spain, there are more men that participate, whereas in other countries there are more women, like for example in Switzerland. I don't know why, we can maybe discuss. The more highly educated, research-rich individuals are more active, tend to be more active, so they also tend to be amongst the activists more. And also the what have been called the baby boomer, I suppose, generation, or the one right after that, the 60s, 70s generation, so people born in those years, is still the most active in most countries actually, although the youngest generation is becoming also very active. So there are also something specific to specific generations that makes them more active in protest activities than other generations. We also found the social bases have widened considerably since the times of the working class labor movements, and including increasingly middle class professionals. We found, as many other studies have already found, I have to say, more resource poor groups tend to be more likely to engage in demonstration over economic issues. Actually, this is something new, because this is something that has been studied prior to our research on the overall set of participants. But we try to distinguish between issues, as I said, and we found that the more resource poor groups are more involved in economic issues. Perhaps this is quite understandable in the end, whereas the richest one are more in the new social movements kind of protest activities. And we also found, as a sort of sum up of this chapter actually, that in order to overcome the higher barriers to participation, those individuals from these groups that do engage and end up being particularly committed. So you will find them especially among what we call the activists. So it's sort of like you do the effort to overcome the barriers of participation, and then you say, okay, I'm going to be strongly active and not only sporadically. Institutional politics, that's one of the, perhaps, as I said, most interesting aspects As you might know, there is a discussion in the literature, and this has been mentioned also by Donatella, between different interpretation of what happens in the interaction between institutional and non-institutional politics. There is an idea of substitution, that is there is a low, a decreasing participation in voting, for example, especially by young generations, and then the argument is that this has been substituted by other forms, which I think is still true in part. So there's a substitution. But what we find actually in our analysis, at least, is there is a complementarity between the two, rather than a substitution or a replacement of institutional with non-institutional politics. So this is because actually those who participate in demonstrations, especially those that participate with strong degree of commitment, so and more frequently, so the activists, are more likely to be involved in institutional modes of engagement. So and this led us to sort of conclude, actually, in this chapter, that it's unlikely that those people that shy away, that don't vote, they don't go to vote anymore, will turn to protest instead, and this actually we think that show or signals a problem that someone, as Russell Dalton has very much worked on, even recently, that this participation gap actually still exists. And so there is it's like, I'm simplifying, but there is a group of well-educated, richer, in general term, people that participate both institutionally and non-institutionally, while there is a group of people that tend to be excluded from all sorts of participation. And this, of course, is problematic in terms of democracy and democratic thinking. We can maybe in the discussion come back to this. So I'm just stressing this aspect for this chapter, since I have only less than 10 minutes left. Mobilizing structures. Here I'm trying to summarize what we found. We have lots of analysis here to explain, well, first to show how the role of mobilizing structures, that is previous embeddedness in organizations, for example, or in social relations, varies across countries, and again across issues and across types of activists, of types of participants. And we also try to explain, because in each chapter actually we also have performed a regression analysis to explain the degree of commitment depending on all these different aspects. So what we come up here is with the idea actually that obviously online mobilizing structures, in a way, so social media, are becoming more important, especially in terms of getting a wider set of people involved in mobilization. But this has its downturn, in the sense that the risk is that more traditional structures, organizations, are progressively being how you say in English, lost in a way, or neglected, and this, I think, is important in terms of the sustainability of mobilization. I think that more traditional mobilizing structures, more traditional way of organizing, are very much what Werther Taylor and Susan Stagenborg have called abeyance structures, and that is those structures that allow movements to keep alive during period of low mobilization, and then when opportunities arise again to mobilize, if you had these kind of structures, it's more likely that you can observe again mobilization or remobilization. And I don't think online, at least as far as I'm concerned, I don't think online means and media and networks are able to do this. and maybe they even go against this. Then in this chapter, we also find support to different kinds of account of protest participation, again, of stronger commitment to protest participation. So we sort of ecumenical conclusion we have in different chapters, actually, I would say, that both structural and psychological and also rational choice explanations, we are the key, the most important kinds of explanation of participation in social movements, they all hold to some extent, I would say. So we cannot oppose one theory to the other, but we have to come up with a combined way of explaining. I don't know, maybe this is quite trivial again, but I think something that we would like to stress. Predispositions. We found important variations and also an important effect of both political attitudes, some political attitudes in particularly, as I mentioned, trust and feeling of efficacy are two very important political attitudes, along with political interest, which is obvious, to explain commitment in participation, but also the different kinds of emotions. Particularly, we focus on anger, worry, and frustration, and a fourth one that I forgot, which also we included, fear. And we found an impact. But what is most important, that we found that the emotional charge is more important, and the effect of emotions is more important for certain types of participants than for others. Those who are more frequently engaged tend to be more especially angry, worried, and frustrated than those who participate sporadically. And this also explains the difference between the two. And the same applies to political attitudes. And finally, to come, now I'm going a little bit quicker perhaps, but we can come back to the discussion. We also worked on the motivations. And here we studied different kinds of motivations, whether people get to the streets based on their interests, so to defend their interests, or based on principle, because they think, for example, that it's important to personally being involved and show discontent and so on, or another kind of motivation is a solidaristic kind of motivation. I'm going into the street for solidarity with others and so on, which I think today is quite important as a motivation. Moral indignation, this is also something that social psychologists have been studying very much. We try to summarize this kind of motivation by a sort of typology where we distinguish between four kinds, which one is combining actually the instrumental versus expressive distinction. So interest versus principle, basically. And on the other hand, the individual collective distinction. And then we come up with this typology of instrumental individual, expressive individual, instrumental collective, expressive collective kinds of motivation. So the main message probably is that there are some motivations that are more important than the other, like, for example, expressing views, pressuring politicians for change, expressing solidarity are the most popular motivations. So there are many more participants said that they were participating for those reasons. But I think, and also expressive and collective tend to be a little bit more central, but the main idea again is sort of ecumenical finding in a way that all kinds of motivations matter and different people get to be mobilized and they get to protesting for different reasons in the end. So you cannot just depict a group of people or a movement like they all have the same reasons why they are there. Of course, they are claiming the same issues, they are manifesting and demonstrating for the same issues and on, but not necessarily for the same reasons in terms of motivation. So to sum up and conclude, I would say that our study, again, with all the limitations due to the kind of data, which are on the one hand rich because we can disaggregate participants, but on the other hand, we cannot really conclude about the reasons why people participate versus they don't participate, but we explain degree of commitment. So depending on how you look at this, you might say, well, this is a strength or this is limitation. For me, it's a strength, of course. I wrote the book. We find the context matters. So as many other social movement scholars and political opportunity theorists, of course, are very happy with this conclusion. The national context, which is the focus of political opportunity theory, but also, and this is the most important aspect, the issue context is also very important. So depending on the issue, you might find different processes and mechanisms explaining why people get to protest and why people are more or less committed or get to protest more frequently or less frequently. So the issue context, I think this is something that still needs more research precisely to go beyond this classical idea that the national context is what provides the political opportunity structure. I know for those who know my work, I'm criticizing myself in a way because I've been working very much for years on this idea of national opportunity structures, which is very much inspired by the work of Charles Tilly, Sidney Tarrow, the other people I mentioned before. Secondly, the explanatory factors and micro-mobilization dynamics play out differently depending on the level of activism of participants in demonstration. That's exactly what I said, actually. So this idea of disaggregating and showing how there are different mobilizing structures, there are different motivations, there are different social structures, there are different relationships between institutional and non-institutional politics, depending on the kind of demonstrator that you are, depending on the degree of activism that you have. So this is also something that I think still deserves to be researched in more detail, and on other data sets, on other periods, on other regions of the world, because again we focused on a number of West European countries in a specific period. So our finding should be read and interpreted in this light. We also found that structure, culture, and rationality all matter to some extent. As you know, not only the study of social movement, sociology more generally, I would say, have long been structured along these three kinds of explanation of human behavior. So the structural factors, the cultural factors, and rational choice approaches. And they've followed different paths for a long time, but then of course there have been people saying, well, for example, structural and cultural are not so different, they are two sides of the same coin. Rational motivations, they are not opposed to the idea that structure matters, but they can be combined, and we go a little bit along these lines. And finally, perhaps the three main findings, or main not really finding, but perhaps lessons. I don't know if I can call them lessons. It's relating to this idea of blurring the boundaries between and beyond protest politics, which we discuss in the conclusion, actually. And there we talk about this idea of pluralization of participants in street demonstration, which is close to what other people have called the normalization of protest politics. So there are many more people. You also observe a blending of cultural and economic issues. Movements in recent years have been mobilizing people with different value orientations, perhaps mobilizing on different also on different issues to some extent within the same movement, or stressing different aspects of the same issues, more the economic side of inequalities, or the more cultural side of global injustices, for example. So this is what we call the blending of cultural and economic issues. And obviously what I mentioned before, the increasing overlap of institutional and contentious politics, which I think is one of the most important aspects today, also because traditionally research on social movements and research, on the other hand, on voting behavior, have not been talking to each other very much. So I think this is something that should be done much more in the next future. And I will conclude. Sorry, I spoke a little bit, and this is the cover of the book, but Donatella has shown already.
Thank you, Marco, very much for this heroic and successful effort to summarize the book, and also several central debates in research on political participations. I think if you read the book, this bridging of social movement studies and research on political participations is a particularly fruitful one. And there are many elements to discuss. I want to give, also, Marco, thanks very much for having done this effort in the sometimes frustrating situations of having to look at an empty screen without actual people there. I hope that we can invite you in person soon. Lorenzo Zamponi will act as a sort of discussant, but questions are welcome. You can also indicate me that you want to ask questions by writing in the chat. Please, Lorenzo.
Okay. Well, hey everyone. I'm Marco.
Lorenzo, I cannot hear you well. I don't know if the others.
You hear me?
No.
Very low.
Very low.
Metti le cuffie, says Lorenzo Cini.
It is usually worse, but okay. I will.
Now it's really very, very low.
Better now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thanks Marco for the presentation. I'll only ask a couple of questions to break the ice and to then give space to more debate. First of all, I have to say that this kind of work that focuses on the micro level of political participation and of collective action in general, and that uses in particular the protest survey. I have to spend a few words on its merits, on why I think that what well, Maria and you have done in this book, but in general has been done in the last few years, I think it is significant for the study of social movements. As you know, I'm a researcher who mainly uses qualitative methods, but I think that especially in the last few years, the most common qualitative methodologies that have been used for the study of social movement, so I'm referring in particular to qualitative interviews, to frame analysis, and so on, have met some significant obstacles, and especially there is the growing tendencies to focus on a particularly politicized strand of established activists. And I don't think this is a problem of the methodologies per se, because for ethnography, okay, gives you the opportunity actually to study collective action in its broader form and to take into account different levels of participation and so on. But the combination between qualitative methodologies and the push to have quick projects and quick results many times makes so that a research project on social movement really becomes getting into a place, doing a few interviews to a few key activists, and then drawing some conclusions out of that. And obviously, this can tell us something about a movement, but we lose a lot of what's going on between the people who are participating in protest events, who are, from the point of view of numbers, most of the movements, but that have low level of commitments that show up only in demonstrations and so on. And I think the protest survey, with obviously all its limitations that we are all very aware of, is useful exactly for this to take a look to these kind of people. Um, what I'm wondering is whether there is the possibility for a fruitful combination between this methodology and this um, focus on individual commitments with low level of engagement, um, with the analysis of meso-level organizational cultures, collective pathways of activism, ideological strands, symbolic and cultural elements of mobilization, which is usually what we try and focus on in qualitative methodologies, what I've been working on for many years. And I'm really wondering whether we can do something at the combination between these two. Okay, if we can somehow find a way to intersect meso-level analysis and these more with the stronger focus on individual level of participation. And also regarding this focus on individual level participation and low level of commitment, together with some colleagues here at the Scuola, we are conducting a small research project on climate mobilization. And at least in the Italian case, it is very clear to us that the divide, which is there in every movement between established activists and people who show up only in protest events, it is even wider than in other movements. Now, this might be, an occurrence, an observation of our specific case study, or there might be um, like the visibilization of some long-term trends, okay, of transformation. What we've been reading about for many years now regarding connective action, regarding um, individualization, and so on. And you were somehow, I think, hinting at that when you were focusing on mobilizing structures in your presentation, a wider divide between a smaller and smaller group of established activists and a larger and larger component of people who only participate occasionally in protest events. And I think that this really poses also some challenges for the study of social movements, but also really for how we consider social movements as actors, okay, how democratic processes take place inside them and so on. So my second question would be what you think about that. Okay, do you think that there are such trends, and can we do something to study them? And the third and last point that I wanted to raise was regarding cross-national comparison. You have a data set that allows a lot for cross-national comparison, and I think you have also very interesting findings based on that. My question is, how should we interpret the findings of cross-national comparisons? Because obviously there is a very common tendency um, to interpret them as the outcome of national political cultures. In Italy, people do politics like that. In Switzerland, people protest in a different way. In Netherlands, and while obviously there are also some, historically grounded elements which are probably strongly contextual in a specific period of time. Um, I was thinking about that when you were showing this high level of protest participation in Spain. Okay, 10 years ago, Spain was considered um, the harbinger of the Nordic transformation of Mediterranean democracy. in which institutional transformation after the transition had somehow allowed people to overcome their crazy southern behavior, okay, and becoming a more civilized democracy. I'm only joking, okay, in engaging only in more conventional forms of protest. Well, obviously, we've seen all of these change in the last 10 years. So my question is, when seeing these results, how do we interpret them? How do we make sure that we're not essentializing national political cultures, and that we are also able um, to embed our interpretation in what's happening from the historical point of view? How did you face this challenge in the book, and how do you suggest others can do a similar thing? Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think these are already several questions that maybe it's better to address now. Just wanted to stress one point of what Lorenzo said, that it is indeed not only climate change forms of protest that are becoming more and more, I don't want to use the term spontaneous, but a very much more horizontal type of organizational structures. So we are studying Black Lives Matter in Italy, and we see that there are many demonstrations organized by traditional social movements, organizations, and networks, but there are also many which are organized by a small group of people. And our research also tends to focus on the more structured organizers. Now, also in the past, for instance, I'm thinking about the reflections on the development of economic sociology. It was said that surveys are a way to capture also the people that are invisible in other arenas, so that you can reconstruct ideas that otherwise are not presented. But of course, surveys also have the limitations that tend to present ideas in a rather superficial way. So I think this is an important reflections on the advantages of surveys to bring in knowledge about groups that are less addressed through qualitative methods, but at the same time also the need to combine on this. I have also another questions which I saw from Delina in the chat. I can add this one. Delina says the gender finding on participations are quite interesting. What do you believe this difference depends upon? But most importantly, have you seen a change in trends in recent years? On these questions, I give Marco the floor back.
Thanks. Maybe first a few, well, not really answers to Lorenzo's comments. I don't know if I really have answers, but maybe some reflections on the the first methodological point. Well, you're right, of course. There are different methodologies, we all know, more quantitative, more qualitative, and there have been lots of calls, not only in social movement field, but more generally in sociology, for what some call the mixed methods approach, combining in some way, systematic way, qualitative and quantitative approaches. I've always been, but that's personal probably, I'm always been a little bit skeptical about these calls and efforts to try to combine, or at least most of the time when I look at how this is combined, and even more when I myself tried to combine, is that you sort of juxtapose actually moments in your research process. That is, you have a first moment, and in this moment you say, okay, here I'm looking more superficially, but I want to generalize, so I'm using a survey, and so I'm going more on the quantitative side, and so on. And then you have usually a second moment where you say, well, now I want to understand more deeply what is going on, what happens. So, and there, of course, I'm looking at processes, I'm looking at motivations, for example, although we tackle motivation with the survey, but probably it's not the best instrument if you want to dig deeper into the motivations and also into these meso-level symbolic aspects that Lorenzo has mentioned. Then you might want to resort to more qualitative approaches. But what I see mostly is that you don't really combine both. Also because I think it depends very much on the research question. I think some methodologies applies more to certain research questions and other methodologies more to other research questions. So that's on the methodological point. The second point, I'm not sure I understood it maybe correctly, but the one on climate and other movements. I'm not sure. When you were speaking, I was also thinking at the same time, so I made confusion to myself. But I know the trend there is a trend between larger group of people participating and a smaller group non-participating. Is that the idea?
Well, the idea was...
Yeah. Please, Lorenzo.
The stronger tendency to occasional participation, okay? Like a wider gap between core established activists and individual participants.
Okay.
Larger and larger street demonstrations and smaller and smaller assemblies.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Well, I don't know if we are really observing this. Well, you said you are studying this also with Donatella. It might be actually that we are observing this, and this might also be explained to some extent by the rise and the increasing usage of social networks in terms of social media. I mean, the online means of recruiting people. So these means, I think, they facilitate recruitment, but they facilitate the recruitment of a sporadic type of participation. So this might actually confirm what you say and explain what you say. What I observe actually in recent movements, and even in some of less recent movements, is this heterogeneity actually of participation as compared to previous movements or more traditional movements. You really have a wider, I think, a wider set of people, again, with different motivation from different backgrounds, sometimes even as I think in the case of the Gilets jaunes in France, people participating in the same demonstrations on the very same issues, but coming with value system and ideology which are quite different and sometimes even opposed. Actually, you might observe leftist and rightist people in the same movement, which I don't think was the case before. So I don't know if it is the same phenomenon, but it shows some changes at least in recent years. On the cross-national differences question, Lorenzo asked how to interpret. Well, you said, of course, the most standard way to interpret cross-national differences is to rely on some features of the national context. You talked about national culture. I prefer to talk about national political opportunity structures, more institutional configurations that might explain national differences. And I think this makes sense because national or cross-national differences are obviously related, at least in part, to characteristic of the national context. Now, at the same time, I think that, again, we should disaggregate a little bit the whole thing, in the sense that as we try to show in the book, actually, there is something beyond these national differences, and there are other kind of cleavages that we can use to study differences amongst participants in demonstration or other forms of protest politics, for that matter. So exactly the idea of looking at different issues, and you might perhaps want to study from that point of view how different or how the same issue differ across countries, but at the same time also look at how different issues differ within the same country. So, and the same for the degree of commitment of participants, I think. So I think we should to go beyond this idea, which is now sort of standard in this kind of comparative studies, that while there is something related either to the cultural, either to the configuration of national structures that explain why you have lots of participants in Spain and Italy and in France, and not, for example, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, or Belgium, or whatever other country. So I think you should cross-cut in a way these national differences with differences on other aspects of the protest. And then the question asked by the gender, I confess I don't really have, I haven't been, at least personally, I haven't been studying precisely this aspect. For us in the book is one among the other aspects that we are studying when we look at the social background. So I don't think I believe something about whether this difference depends on what. So, and I don't even know if we can observe a change in trends in recent years. Our data, at least here, they don't allow us to look at changes in trends of participation. I think you refer to the fact that in some countries there are more women that participate, whereas in other countries there are more men that participate. So I couldn't really say actually on this specific point, I have to say. Maybe some other of you have some ideas.
Well, some ideas on this, having participated in the project, the hints I can give is we should see which were the specific demonstrations that were covered, because it is possible that since there is variation on the types of demonstrations, that maybe in some countries there were more of a certain type. And as Marco also stressed, the type of methods that we have been using is very interesting in understanding who are the people on the street in that specific type of protest, but less useful in terms of generalizing results on entire movement sectors or countries and so on, because they are very much influenced by the type of marches that are covered. So for instance, for this project, we covered 3 1st of May demonstrations, and they were very different from each other. Not all the countries covered 3 1st of May demonstrations, because it was different the ways in which decisions were made on what to cover. So I think it's an important question to address, but we have to do more to analyze it. What emerges in our research is that in recent forms of protest, women are more present, also more visible. And this could be related with the fact that some of the movements that have been more active recently, like Non Una di Meno, not one less, is been focusing a lot on gender issues and women's rights. But this is something that goes beyond this type of demonstration, showing more visibility of women also on climate change, which was not the case before, but also on recent forms of protest. In Italy, for instance, on the movement for returning to schools in persons, and I think it is an important issue to address also from the qualitative point of view. The other things that I wanted to mention for the debate we were having is that it would be also interesting to see to which extent we will have in the future also to expand a bit the set of questions that we asked about political participation, which means also how do we define even before operationalizing it. And in this, one of the turning points that I mentioned and Marco also addressed was when political participation studies included unconventional forms of activities that were not related to electoral participation, that the first type of broadening of the perspective developed. Now what we saw is, for instance, that for climate justice movements, but also for other movements, type of activities that we had not usually analyzed as part of political participations are instead politicized. So that maybe we have always to keep an eye open about how to adapt our set of questions to other emerging ones. Now I'm going to read another question for Marco by Federica, who says, I know that this was out of the scope of your book, but how do you make sense of people who, despite coming from a ground of disenchantment and disaffections towards institutional politics, common also to the activists, turn their skepticism into deference and acquiescence rather than rebellion? What differentiates them from equally disenchanted but more politically engaged individuals? Marco.
Before I answer this, just quickly, I was looking at the gender effect, and actually the comparison across country might be a little bit tricky to look at, because when we do the regressions, actually when we control for the countries and for the kinds of issue, we systematically find that the same effect actually of gender on participation, on the degree of commitment of participation. So systematically, actually, men are more likely to participate, or to be more accurate, they show a stronger commitment to participation than women. So net of the country differences. The other question, yeah, it's an interesting question. Obviously, saying that people who are who participate and who belong to what Pippa Norris has called the critical citizens, for example, that is people who have a low trust in institutions and in the representative classical representative democracy. So saying that those people display this kind of institutional disenchantment, to take your words, doesn't mean that the other way around. Doesn't mean that all those who are disenchanted, they turn to participate in politics, of course, as you said. So there are other factors, and I think here's what I would say is simply that one should look at the other aspects, and there are many other that facilitate participation in social movement, and then you can rely on standard explanations also of political participation in general. Again, it depends very much on your previous socializations, how and in which way you were socialized to politics rather than not. The fact of being asked, so that the structural element that is very much stressed in classical theory of participation, for example, in the civic voluntarism model, but also by social movement scholars or networks, the role of interpersonal networks that explain. So it's probably, and many other, biographical availability, to mention another factor that has been very popular in social movement studies. So it's probably, again, a combination of factors. You cannot just say simply, and I hope my presentation didn't convey this message, that because you are disenchanted, because you mistrust institution, then you go into the street, or even worse, you get into violent activities and so on. So I don't know if this is an answer, but I think we should look at other. It's a multiplicity of factors that explain participation.
Yes, I agree, and I thank Marco for this presentation, and all of you for the debate. Before closing this part of our encounter with Marco today, just want to remind you that at 5 o'clock we will have a Cosmos Roundtable on the developments in Bolivia with the return of mass in power, with Santiago Andria and Leonidas Oikonomakis, and all are welcome to come back in the afternoon. Now for the rest of the day with Marco, I suggest that we take a 15 minutes break, and then we reconvene with the participants to the seminar on democratic theories in order to discuss the positional papers and to further discuss Marco's ideas. So thank you all. Valentina remind us that the talk seminars has been registered and will be streamed on our channel. And other people are saying thanks a lot and so on. So thank you all. Thank you, Marco, very, very much. And thank you, Lorenzo. And thanks to the participant. And see you very soon for the continuation of the discussion with Marco, with the participants to the seminar. And for those of you who are interested in the afternoon for the Cosmos Roundtable.